We were a silhouette against the last of the light. The ute had dug into the Finke's braided channel and listed like a wounded animal. The bonnet was a low ridge against shallow black water. At noon it would have looked harmless. Sand and spinifex, pale and ordinary. By dusk it was a hard, dark thing, an animal swollen into its banks. The tyres had chewed themselves down into soft, wet sand until the axles sat on grit. The engine was dead and useless. We stood with our hands on the roof and watched the sun hunch behind the western ridgeline. The color bled out to leaden gray. Gaz lit a cigarette and held the match long enough for the flame to smoke his knuckles. He stood as if nothing had shifted, as if patience and fiddly human stubbornness could coax the ute back. Mick paced the low bank with his back to us. He paced like a man who wanted to be alone and angry at the same time. He kept his hands in his pockets and his head down. I could see him in silhouette and know his shoulders were tight. He was my brother. That fact sat between us like a thing you could bruise yourself on. We had to make Alice by Arvo, he'd said when we left. The plan had been simple. Take the back line. Save time. Avoid the highway cops and the long loop. The ute was loaded with a crate of parts, greasy things for the family yard, and cash in envelopes wedged in the glove box. There was a job waiting in Alice that would keep the yard open another week without asking for credit. It had been a day where the land lay flat and indifferent. You get days like that, and start to believe shortcuts are neutral. The road narrowed to sand, then to a track the ute hugged with care. I remember the tyres kicking small moons of grit as we took the corners. There was a smell as the air cooled, wet salt from the river, leaf litter, something like old diesel. Somewhere a dog barked like an afterthought. We were three men in a leaking world. Gaz worked with his hands and hated fuss. Mick talked too loud and buried softer things in jokes. I had the license and the plan, and the habit of thinking everything had a way back. Saying we'd make Alice by Arvo felt like a promise we could cling to. The bank where we crossed was soft as talc. I saw it first in motion, a faint give under the front wheels like the earth letting go of its promises. I said it aloud, soft. The word fell flat, more observation than warning. We were over the shallow and easing off the gas when the front dipped, like someone letting a car roll into slow surrender. The tyres sank. Gaz gunned it. The wheels spun. The engine coughed and died. There was an odd quiet afterwards, full of small sounds. The drip of water off the tailgate, a distant bird, the scrape of sand, as the tray settled. We did the things you do when the earth cheats you. Rocket reverse, feather the throttle. Mick got out and shoved at the mud flaps with everything he had, and came back with grit under his nails. Gaz unhooked the front tow point and climbed onto the tray to dig a channel. I grabbed a shovel and dug with a kind of dumb hope. The sand gave but was treacherous. Every scoop collapsed under itself. The ute settled lower. It was clear we'd misread the place. Somewhere upstream clouds had dumped water. The river had risen that afternoon and sent a slow, patient tide down channels we'd meant to respect. The bank we'd crossed had been dry for weeks, and now it held the weight of the world and made a meal of our tyres. The tray filled with grit. The air cooled quicker than the light. Mick muttered about getting to high ground. "I'll go and find us somewhere to camp," he said. His voice had a line of steel I hadn't heard before. He pulled his collar up and walked away. The motion felt like a cork being tipped. Deliberate and sudden. We watched him until he became a dark smear against the spinifex, and then the river took him. Gaz said nothing. He cupped his cigarette and looked toward our ruts in the sand, the ones that would be hard to erase. The plan had been to cross early, get to Alice, drop the parts and make our call. You could see in Gaz's face that plan had been as much a promise as an instruction. We were late, and the clock of light had its own counting. Mick always needed to be somewhere higher than his problems. He thought distance could dissolve obligation. Youth was on his side, a jaw that answered before thinking. I had learned, the hard way, that when Mick made a choice, it rarely let everyone else off easy. He was my brother, and I loved him like you love a storm, beautiful, dangerous and necessary. When he walked off, my stomach clenched with a protective panic. We should have gone with him. We should have made him stay. Instead, we stayed with the ute, trying to salvage dignity and mechanical sense from the greedy sand. Night came fast in the desert. The last of the light cut across the tires like a blade, and the sky darkened until trees and gullies became pure black. The river turned into an absence where mirrors had been. The world shrank to the cone of our torches and the small sound of water at the edge of sand. The ute had a radio that spat static and a cigarette lighter that still worked. We turned the radio on and off like a metronome. The heat leached from the earth, and cold filled the air with that clean sting you get after a hot day. I sat on the tailgate and watched puddles glitter, studying them like reading some answer in their flat surface. We rationed. There was a crate of water bottles and a half-empty bottle of vodka wrapped in an old towel. The vodka had been for the week, something to take the edge off late nights in the yard. Gaz suggested a cut-off, 2 small measures between the 3 of us for the night. We poured into a dented tin cup and passed it around. It tasted like a memory of better things, sharp and sweet. We dipped the water into old cups and spread the supply, not out of cruelty, but because water matters in ways money never does. The river was mocking us with abundance while this water was our lifeline. I counted swallows in my head, and when the last might come, we tried to sleep. There is a particular kind of quiet that sits in the bottom of places like the Finke. It is full of the landscape's old things, remnants, bark, the slow creak of branches. It presses on your ears until your heartbeat sounds like a drumline. Gaz dozed against the cab with a cigarette folded between his fingers and smoke like a small prayer. I lay curled in the passenger seat with the vodka towel over my knees, calculating the night in degrees and possible escape routes in a ledger that kept shifting. You learn to sleep in measurements in situations like that. 2 hours I keep watch, 2 hours Gaz, and perhaps Mick will saunter in with a bruise and a grin in the morning, and everything will be the same. Instead, we listened. We heard animal feet at the scrub and the high, uncertain call of a bird. We heard the river whispering through shelves of sand. We heard our own breath, too loud and useless. The vodka warmed our chests but did not change the mind. The darkness made everything sharp and brittle. Worry settled into me like a slow accumulation, a fine grit between my ribs that rubbed with every breath. I found myself rehearsing what I'd say to Mum if I got home without Mick. The sentences came like shop-worn tools. I'm sorry. We took a chance. It got worse. In the dim of the ute, I ran through the decisions that led us there. The shortcut, faith in the road, trust in a man who loved to disappear. Gaz mumbled in half-sleep with practicalities. Check the axle, see if the air's out. But he did not say the thing about what would happen if Mick didn't come back. We didn't make promises in the dark. Promises felt useless. I had the idea of a signal. I dug through the tray for spare bulbs, a reflective triangle, anything to catch a car's eye. There was a crippled torch with half the casing missing. Its beam shook when I turned it on. I set it on the roof and pointed it downriver, more to give myself something to do than out of expectation. We tried the radio again. Mostly static. We picked up the ragged edge of a station talking football scores from a city that might as well have been on another planet. Around a small fire of spare wood and sodden branches, the conversation flickered between practicalities and resentments. Mick's leaving put an edge on every word. Gaz kept to instructions. When he spoke, he said, "People sometimes go off to find high ground. Needs do that." His acceptance felt like acceptance of a bad fact rather than forgiveness. I wasn't so prepared. I could only feel the dark like a hand closing and patient. The vodka disappeared slow. We chewed a stale packet of biscuits until our teeth ached. The small nourishment felt like an insult. Every now and then I stepped from the cab to look down the bank where Mick had walked, and imagination painted the spinifex black with shapes. Each time my throat tightened and my hands went empty. You learn new things about fear at that hour, how it makes you small, and how it makes you acutely aware of silence. We took turns watching. Gaz's eyes were pragmatic and slow, born from hours in a workshop and nights waiting for machinery to cool. I tried to catalog every sound and shadow to make a map of threats in the little light we had. The logic was simple. If a car came, it would blink its lights. If a plane passed, we might see beams. If Mick returned, he'd be a shape on the sand. The list of possible returns was thin. My mind kept going back to the crate of parts, the envelopes, the job in Alice. They felt like islands I could not reach from where we sat. Sleep came in short, stolen minutes. When I woke with my mouth like sandpaper, Gaz rubbed the heel of his hand over his face. The vodka bottle was smaller. The water cooler similarly reduced. Mick was not back. There were no footprints heading up to the high ground he promised to find. The sand beside the ute showed people moving in circles, not a man walking away. For a moment I imagined him crouched behind a scrub, laughing at our worry. I pushed the thought away. I thought of calling for help. Our phones were useless in the bush and batteries would be a joke. We had a small EPIRB in the back, standard for people who drove the long lines. Pressing it felt obscene for something that might yet be a false alarm. Calling meant admitting failure. Doing nothing felt like slow agreement to a worse fate. We sat and watched the torch make a cone of light. When the sky was black enough, I told Gaz I would go down river to the next bend. He said nothing at first, then shrugged like a man who'd accepted necessity. "Take the torch," he said. "Lock the cab." I took a torch and half a bottle of water. My hands were steady and cold. The riverbank under the flashlight was a cut, white and detailed and cruel. I walked up and down it like a miner with a lamp, searching for brush signs or a boot print. I called Mick's name in short bursts, loud enough to put the sound into the night but not foolish. The call came back in pieces, swallowed by the flat. I walked until my legs were tired, and the air felt thin. I turned back because of a dull, inevitable fear that there was nothing for me to find. The lamp made a log a man, and a shadow a face. I came back to the ute to find Gaz crouched by the wheel turning lug nuts with a gloved hand. He looked up as I approached and his face said what words did not. "He's gone," I said, the hollowness where my voice should have been. Gaz nodded once and kept working. We made a plan we didn't know we were making. Stay with the ute until first light, then follow where Mick had gone. If we couldn't find him, go to the nearest station and get help. The outline was simple and brittle. We sealed the doors with a rough ritual and left the radio on a low whisper. We put the last of the water in separate bottles and set them beside the seats. We wrapped the towel around the vodka and put it beneath a seat where it might be found in the light. Night continued to use up the hours until there was nothing left of them. Fear in the dark brings a clarity daylight washes away. I knew every mistake then, the bank that looked like a road, trusting a man who loved to disappear. I knew the thin difference between courage and recklessness, when men in a rush make other people's livelihoods part of the plan. The river kept its counsel. It did not care for explanations or plans. It held what it had taken, and let the rest be. When the sky hinted at day, I walked the bank again. I searched the flat for anything Mick might have left. A scarf, a boot mark, the tell of a shelter behind a hummock. There were small things, a cigarette butt, a crushed biscuit packet. Where Mick had walked there were thin occasional prints, and then nothing. The idea he had gone to high ground changed shape into multiplying fears. The light did not bring him back. It only showed what the night had hidden, a place that swallowed a man and kept his story. In our town everything sat on a ledger. Not just accounts but small entries people made against one another, favors, grudges, crosses to bear. You learned who owed who petrol at the servo, and who could lend a van for a week. I thought of that ledger as we sat on the bank with the ute muffled by sand and the vodka hidden like a secret. Mick had never been subtle with debts. He wore them in his gait, and in the way he'd smile one man into trusting him, and another into keeping distance. He'd been the reason we left the highway, not for scenery, but for work. A job the family had picked up north of Alice. A contract to haul parts, fix a fence, and prove we could still do the hard immediate work that kept the bills from growing. Dad's name was on the tender. Mine followed. Mick's was an addendum we used to smooth things over. The business lived in the interstices of favor and force. Mick knew that, and he also liked to cut corners. He borrowed, promised, and spent the next week apologizing with 2-minute noodles and a grin. In the months before we left the yard, there had been blunt signs. The blokes at the roadhouse called him Mikey the Mover, the way you call off a stray, affectionate and sour. There were bounced checks Dad fixed quietly, because family came first. There were phone calls I patched through because Mick wasn't good with numbers, and worse at facing people he'd wronged. He'd been meeting a man from the far side of town who preferred back rooms and lit his smokes with other people's commitments. I didn't like how Mick's jaw tightened when that man came up in conversation. It's business, he'd say, but business and trouble sit on a thin line when it's someone you love. Old debts in a small place are like landmines. You step near them and sometimes the ground takes you. We weren't naive about the possibility Mick had walked into trouble he couldn't handle. He had a pride that wouldn't let him admit fear. I'd heard him whisper his name on the phone when he thought no one could hear. He'd borrowed against the ute and the future of the yard. He's used Father's name to take on jobs and then sold himself short to keep cash flowing. People keep reckonings in wallets and words. I could see why the hole in the river might be more than an accident. That possibility made me look at the prints differently. They weren't just erratic marks of a man crossing a bank. They could be a man meeting someone he'd borrowed from, someone who'd come to collect. They could be a man who'd called a favor that didn't end well. If so, that meant decisions had been made about him that didn't involve us. Small towns don't like strangers making those decisions. We talked in the way men do, when night won't let them sleep, elliptical and careful. Gaz kept his voice low, and measured as if hard facts would be louder than thunder. Could be he met someone, he said. His hands were oil under his nails, and his knuckles brown from the lug wrench. Could be he's gone walkabout. Could be he fell and rolled out of sight. Don't start thinking worst. I've seen what people do when you owe them, I told him. Saying it aloud made it sharper, like snapping a wire. Stacks of blokes in town who don't like losing money. They don't always do it alone. We both knew our fights at the yard. I had tried to pull the business away from its patterns. No more letting clients slip a week on payment, no more covering bad bets. Mick took it as betrayal. He left notes in the toolbox, took small things to prove he could run without me. I had been angry enough at times to want distance. Standing on that wet bank, watching the river make the morning dull metal, I wondered whether my anger had opened the space that let someone else take him. When the light came, we set out. We followed the bank like a frayed thread. Gaz took the left where spinifex made ground harder. I kept the riverline because Mick hated going inland when water was his compass. We moved slow, no point sprinting the country. That was for police and their flashlights. We had to be methodical. We found the first clue under a bleached mulga within an hour. A glass bottle lay smashed near the tree, shards like a constellation in sand. There was a drop of amber in the neck. Mick favored cheap vodka when he needed his hands steady. Nearby, a cigarette had been stubbed in dirt, with the filter chewed the way a man who didn't care would chew it. There were footprints around it, a pair heavier than Mick's, and another with heavy soles. The heavier set moved purposefully. Looks like he's met someone, Gaz said without judgment this time. His voice was flat, with whatever might have been relief or a mask of it. We followed those heavier prints inland, and the thin ones along the bank. They ran together and apart like two conversations where one man spoke quickly and another answered in monosyllables. When the track split, we stopped and argument started, the way bad decisions do, quietly and reasonable sounding. We go separate, Gaz said. You take the river, I cut inland, round up more ground. No, I said without thinking. It isn't sensible, he replied. If he wanted, we've doubled our chances. If he didn't wander, we need to move like a lid, not like two blades, I said. Gaz looked at me like he was weighing stubbornness as virtue or sickness. You're thinking someone took him and you want to find them yourself, is that it? Isn't that right? I said, sharper than I meant. If he'd been taken, yes. Also because if there was a quarrel we'd avoided, I wanted to be the one who found him first. We argued, until words ran out, and the country had the last say. It threw up a low ridge of termite mounds, and a dry wash where the tracks crossed. In the cracked bed the prints were confused, mixed thin soles and another set deeper and dragged. The scrape was slight, a smear rather than a gouge, but it changed the rhythm. You read rhythm in this country because rhythm is how life keeps going. When rhythm shifts you pay attention. We followed the changed rhythm for hours. Sometimes the land gave clear things. A scrap of shirt fiber snagged on spinifex matched the weave of Mick's t-shirt. A tuft of hair clung to a branch like a half-said sentence. We found his lighter, bent open, like he'd flicked and hidden it. We found a smear of mud where a knee had scraped, and someone had cursed quietly. Other times, the land offered only hints. Tracks would lead into shrubs and evaporate, as if someone had downhill rolled into scrub and vanished. The wind smoothed prints into anonymity in minutes. An animal, a dog or emu, could step through and obscure the story. You get the sense of being watched by a place that tucks its cards away. I'd learned to distrust that silence. It defers rather than empties. The country keeps things like a miser keeps coins, tucked in a harmless place until you need them. At one point a set of prints led us to a fence line where wire had been cut and tied back clumsily. An old boundary every farmer knows is only respected when money or pride insists on it. The cut looked recent. Beyond it 2 sets of prints, one small and urgent, one big and measured. The big ones were deliberate. A man hauling something along by the shoulders. The small ones were trying to keep up. The rational part of me let darker thoughts in. If someone had cut the wire to move a person into a truck, they'd have had to be efficient. They'd have to know the river bend, and the road out, and how far 2 men could go before they stopped. In our town some men know the geography like priests, know scripture. They can plan routes, reckon shouts and timings. By noon we'd followed tracks in a long loop that had near broken our feet. Gaz's ankle swelled where a stone rolled under his boot. My shoulders ached from hauling branches and lifting worry. We found where someone had tried to start a fire then given up. Blackened stones, with an empty can. Around it the chill was visible in the way grass pressed down. We did not know whether we'd found the scene of a fight or a rest stop. The thinness of the leads gnawed. We turned back because the sun moved the wrong way and our water ran low. My collarbone felt like it might split from tension. Gaz's face had that hollow men get when calculating a price and finding it expensive. We had walked like men who thought the earth had absorbed too many secrets and decided to cough one up. Instead it taught us to ask and not tell. We limped to the station where people can do something, and where an owner knows everyone. The approach road was a bruise on the land, and the station house stood like something meant to weather more than ordinary rain. The owner took one look, dust, blood, Gaz's ankle turned weird, my shirt used as a headband. He came out without fuss and put coffee into mugs like a chemical that fixed wrong things. He radioed for help, a rig from the Shire, because the station owed a favor and favors thread through small towns. He didn't ask how business had treated us or why Mick had been there. He simply called the cavalry, with the efficiency of a man who'd seen enough to know when to do that. We waited, and the waiting arranged into assessment. The rig that arrived was quieter than I'd thought. 2 men in a truck, uniforms neutral gray so they belonged to the world rather than the town. They were efficient. They checked us for things that make the Shire take notice. They listened to our reporters 1 notch in a larger ledger they keep of missing people. They offered to radio other stations, pass our coordinates, send a dog team if the ground allowed. There were long pauses where the men looked at the map with cool disgust, as if the land had tricked them before. The Shire man said words like evidence and pattern, and the way he said time made it sound the clock we kept didn't match the one the country keeps. At the station, a wall of faces I recognized gathered in that private way small towns do. The woman who'd given Dad a loan, the boy whose father I'd taught to fix a carburetor. They were there because news travels with the velocity of gossip and the weight of duty. Someone had called and left tips, a man seen on the old track, a UHF burst of shouting, then silence. There were people ready to help, and people whose faces meant they were keeping watch on their own ledgers. The Shire's tow rig ferried us out because the ute was no use on that bank. The driver was a stranger with soft hands who arranged to keep the rig at the council yard until the insurance men came. Gaz rode in the cab with me, head leaning back against the glass. Every now and then he'd wince like a man feeling an old injury. They took our statements in the station kitchen where the floor was scuffed with a dozen lives. The man with notes asked questions that box a person into neat categories: time, place, descriptions. I answered because I had to, and found myself editing. I left out the small cruelties between Mick and me because there was no legal line to tie them to his disappearance. To say we had argued about money would open a chapter I couldn't close. To say I had wanted him gone in heat of a spat would hand motive to a world that would use it like tinder. When the rig pulled away, it took us toward the Shire, and people who could organize proper searches. The station owner pulled a man aside and told him to watch our backs in a way that sounded like a promise. In the cab, Gaz finally let his mask slip. "You think he left?" he asked. "I don't know what I think," I said. "I think he split off. I think someone met him. I think he might have been taken. I think a dozen things at once." "And the yard?" Gaz asked. "Does this change anything?" "Everything in our town boomerangs. What happens on the road comes back home. If Mick had been taken for debts, the ledger between our family and the town would change. Little men would make quiet calls and decide next moves. If he'd left, the yard would have to reckon with that. A son gone, a reputation frayed. If he'd been taken because of something I said or didn't say, I'd carry a weight that wouldn't let me sleep regardless. The Shire truck left us at the bitumen, where other people could take lines we couldn't. They promised to follow our GPS marks, sweep fence lines and check angles, where ordinary life becomes something else. They told us to go home if we needed. Home felt heavier than before. The yard stood between us and closure, and the yard needs people to be whole to run. The station owner put a cup of something hot in our hands and offered cash for the drive back. His sympathy wasn't pity, it was the understanding of a man who'd seen how deeds fold and unfold. We climbed into the rig's old cab and rode the highway back like men given a small reprieve. The ute sat behind the river in my mind like a bad photograph. The river had swallowed one man and kept his story. The company line was that searches take time and weather and animals obscure evidence. We knew the ledger of the town would write additions long before the final entry. We arrived at the yard with pockets light in the knowledge of what we'd followed. Mick was missing, and the things we found, broken glass, a lighter, snagged fabric, were poor substitutes for a man. They were clues, thin as breath. At home the house was the same, but the air had anticipation like a held note. Dad asked about the ute and I told facts, because facts are all you can be responsible for. I left out the ledger and half-formed suspicions. I left out how I wondered if our fights had helped excavate the space that let someone take him. That night I lay awake thinking about choices. About the bank that looked like a road. About calluses on Dad's hands, and how they had always been mine whether I used them or not. Choices thread through days until one moment falls. You can trace decisions back and blame yourself for a wrong turn. Or, you can accept that some things are weather, unpredictable, indifferent, large. Mick's choices had been many, and so were mine. If he had walked into danger, or accepted a meeting that cost more than cash, then his debts were not only financial. If he'd left, because being in our fold felt like a line he didn't want to stand in, then his disappearance was absconding and failure. Either way, the river had taken something that belonged to the three of us and refused to give it back. I thought of the river as a thing that keeps counsel and doesn't bother with excuses. It swallows, and it sits, and it lets birds use its bank for a day. People talk about being forgiven by landscape as if a place can make you whole. Mostly landscape remembers, it archives. It keeps the stories you would rather not tell because it has room and you don't. Gaz and I were picked up by men who knew how to be practical about missing people. They put our names into the system and filed the evidence we collected. They advised we not leave town in case more questions needed asking. We replayed small things because that was all we had. The sound of his voice as he walked away, the way his shoulders were too tight. At night the house registered every creak as a possible answer. I lay awake counting choices like a mechanic counts sockets, logically by size and use, as if arranging them right would start him up again. A week after the first reports, a man from a neighboring property left an envelope at our gate. Inside was a single shoelace, gritty and frayed. It should have been useless but landed in my palm like a verdict. Gaz folded the note into his pocket and walked to the shed as if to work. We answered questions slowly, with accurate detail that still left the heart wide. We went to the coroner, left statements, collected what evidence we could, and made lists. We were told not to leave town. We didn't. Friends brought casseroles and coffee. The town's gossip used the space between us like a lens focusing for answers. Some people offered practical theories. He'd been drunk and walked into scrub. Others were meaner. He'd run from debts. Some were soft. He'd met someone and taken off. All of them wanted the ledger right. I was tired of ledgers. We kept the business running because the ledger demanded it. Men with places of business measure risk by rows on spreadsheets and need prediction. An accountant told us the run next week must be covered. A missing brother could be a staffing problem in modern mercy. We signed forms, rearranged rosters, did what the ledger demanded while the river kept its own accounts. People cannot store grief like invoices. It sits in odd places, under the kitchen table, the passenger seat, the bootless space where a man used to be. I found it in the glove box as a folded receipt, and my hand slid over leather into absence. It felt like theft. Months congealed into pattern. The men with clipboards came now and then. Photographers took images of mud-colored things and called it evidence. The town mended fences. The business adapted. Women at the post office kept distance, then did not. A child would ask about Mick in the grocery store and put innocence on absence that adults couldn't bear. We answered carefully and moved on. No one offered a miracle. There were other offers. A man from Alice sat at our kitchen table months later and asked plain questions. "You boys want to make a trade?" he asked. I made myself clear we weren't interested in the kind of help that smelled of retribution. He talked about men in town who felt stiffed and suggested settling accounts might soothe them. It was pity wrapped in practicality. I said we'd call our accountant. He left with a smile that meant nothing kind. Gaz shut the door and said, "We keep trying." He said it like a prayer and a job description. Choices have gravity and tilt tables. We did not take the quick fix that night. We kept our hands on the work. My mother went back to the river once with an old photograph and sat on a rock until the sun set. She said, "He used to catch crayfish here." The river said nothing. Dad signed a supplier contract with our name as guarantor, and I felt the weight of our name like a loaded thing. The business needed us to carry on whether we wanted to or not. Months passed, and the men with clipboards had fewer questions. Fewer patrols came round. Police said investigations take time and water keeps secrets for winters. It was a formal way of saying, live with a story unfinished. We lived inside that sentence. People in town stopped visiting as often. We were left with our company and the private reckonings that have no accounting. I learned to bargain with the past and gave small concessions. I drove the long road at night with my headlight cutting a single path through darkness and the radio low. Driving that road teaches the difference between speed and distance. The silence there measures you in increments. I used to think a brother was someone who would fix things when you called. Now I knew brothers could become unaccounted for line items. They can be catapulted into absence by chance or choice and leave the rest of you to reconcile a ledger that won't close. Gaz and I drove back to the crossing one work night months on from the first incident. The sky was low with rain. We parked and walked to the rutted riverbed where the track cuts into water. I had thought being a good brother was something you could maintain. Beside the water I learned it's a living series of actions that can be starved. The river was black and moved like a machine that had learned stillness. We stood and listened to it like you listen to a distant engine. Gaz kicked at a rock. He said, "We keep trying." "We keep trying," I echoed, which is what we say when we mean we carry on, because not carrying on would admit the world is built of too many missing things. The town stitched itself back into rhythm. The men at the pub told fewer theories and began to nod at us across counters. A few left for places where small-town ledgers matter less. A few stayed. Life sutured itself in small, tidy ways. I never stopped thinking about the river's memory. I went once with a fishing rod and watched the water take and keep what it wanted. It gives up a twig, then a shoe, then a bend. It does not guarantee answers. It keeps counsel. The ledger still sits on my desk. There is a pencil mark on the line that reads Mick. Missing, no figure beside it. An empty column. Unsatisfying and honest. I've reached a kind of reckoning. Choices aren't only the things you make that night in the sand. They are the small ones in months before. What to say and what to withhold. My choices were many. Mick's were many too. The river accepted them both into its volume, without accounting for why. Sometimes, in the dark when the house's practical chores are done, I drive the long road and let silence press into me. I imagine Mick walking the sand beside the ute and put the radio low so my voice can be as soft as I want. The road doesn't answer, but it hears. If you've driven it at night, you know how the darkness measures you. We never found a neat line in the accounts to make things sensible. We never closed the entry. We learned to work with absence the way men with ledgers learn to carry on, by never letting the missing number define all that remains. We kept the yard running. We paid creditors and renegotiated terms. Gaz took on the runs Mick used to do, his face part smoothed by duty. I took fewer risks on the night roads and planned trips more carefully. The town, as towns do, folded us into its quiet. There is no final accounting. Only the slow accumulation of living in the wake of a missing brother. The river keeps its secrets. We keep our work. We keep our watch. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence. How it makes small things large, and leaves the rest to be carried between you and whatever is gone. That silence has been our companion. It taught us to speak less, and to listen more, like keeping an engine ticking when you are waiting. We will keep listening. We will also keep working. The ledger stays open and so do our hands. The town waits in its own way. The river remembers. In the spaces between those things, I live and count, and hope that one day some small, undeniable piece of truth will wash up on the bank and let us make the line in the book final. Until then I kept the ledger, I kept the house, I left the kitchen light on for whatever fragment of him might find its way home.